Hey everybody, Racially Inaccurate Jesus here. I hope everybody had a good Christmas and got lots of cool presents for my birthday. I didn't get anything too fancy myself. I asked my dad for forgiveness and understanding for all of humanity, and he got me these two big pieces of wood, like, nailed to each other. Yeah, yeah. I was like, what even is this? And he was like, well, I thought you liked carpentry. And I'm like, yeah, it's an okay job. It pays decently and I get to make things for people, which is cool. And, I had enough time off to go preach and wander the wilderness and perform miracles and all that cool stuff. But, like, this is just two big pieces of wood, at least if he got me, like, a power saw or something, could have done something with that, could have made things for people. It's not forgiveness and understanding, but it's something, But he was like, well, if you don't like it, you can go hang on it and die. And I was like, well, maybe I would if you'd actually forgive humanity for their sins like I asked you for. And he was like, well, fine, maybe I will. And I was like, fine. And so, yeah, not the best birthday ever. Family, Gotta love them, even when they make it difficult. But anyway, you girls and boys aren't here to hear me talk about my personal problems. You're here for complex and nuanced discussions of the problems facing humanity today. And boy, do I have one for you. See, there have been a number of incidents in the news lately of police officers killing unarmed black men, which has sparked a lot of discussions about whether or not the U.S. criminal justice system is operating in a racially biased way. Now, it would be tempting to rehash every individual case and, give you all the details of who said and did and thought what, and who I judge to be guilty of sin in each case. But since none of you are ever going to be as omniscient as I am, that's not going to help you deal with your future problems as much as looking at the big picture would. As long as I've got the whole world in my hands, might as well show a little bit of it to you. See, the U.S. has the highest incarceration rate in the entire world, at about 4 to 5 times the world average, and holds almost 1/4 of the world's prisoners. Considering that the U.S. only holds 5% of the world's population, that's a lot of prisoners. So the U.S. has been doing an awful lot more judging than most countries. Let's see how they like getting judged. Now, the criteria that America's justice system will be judged on is fairness. Does the U.S. criminal justice system judge and punish people based on the amount of harm that they do to other people? Or do they let other factors affect their decisions? Do they operate without bias against certain groups of people? Well, unfortunately, the evidence shows pretty clearly that there is bias in the U.S. criminal justice system against certain groups of people. For one, the U.S. population is about 12% black, and yet about 28% of people arrested are black, meaning that you're more than twice as likely to be arrested if you're black than the average member of the population. Now, remember that we're judging America's criminal justice system based on whether or not it punishes people fairly for their actions. So before we can find the criminal justice system guilty of sin, we have to ask whether or not this difference in arrests is due to differences in behavior between blacks and the rest of the population or not. And, well, there are a lot of crimes where, honestly, you can't perfectly answer that question because none of you are omniscient, and you can't always know who actually committed a crime. But for some crimes, there has been a considerable amount of research done on how frequently those crimes are committed by members of each race. For example, 31% of people arrested for drug crimes are black, but only 11% of people who have used drugs during their life are black, and about 14% of people who've used drugs in the past month are black. So blacks are slightly less likely than whites to have ever used drugs. They're only slightly more likely than whites to have used drugs within the past month, but they're more than twice as likely to get arrested for drug crimes. So blacks are slightly less likely than whites to have ever used drugs, only slightly more likely to have used drugs recently, but more than twice as likely to be arrested for drug crimes. Clearly, the difference in arrest rates for drug crimes is much bigger than the difference in drug use rates between races, which is evidence that some form of bias exists in the criminal justice system, at least in the area of drug arrests. But there are other crimes where the disparity is even greater. See, blacks are about half as likely to own guns as whites, and yet blacks make up 40% of people arrested for gun control violations. This means that black gun owners are about 7 times more likely to be arrested for gun control violations than white gun owners. Even if some of that difference is due to differences in behavior between blacks and the rest of the population, cases like that of Shaneen Allen, a woman who was arrested for carrying a concealed weapon that she had a concealed carry permit for, suggest that bias plays a role. Another crime with massive racial disparity is gambling. There's some evidence that suggests that blacks are almost twice as likely as whites to have a gambling problem, so it would be reasonable to expect blacks to be about twice as likely to be arrested for gambling, so we should expect just over 20% of people arrested for gambling to be black. Instead, 67% of people arrested for gambling are black. The racial disparity in gambling arrests is many times bigger than the disparity in who has a gambling problem. But there's something else that drug laws, gun control laws, and gambling laws have in common other than just being enforced with more racial disparity than our criminal justice system overall. Each of these is a victimless crime, meaning that there's no direct link between someone committing any of these crimes and actually harming another human being. The vast majority of drug users, gun owners, and gamblers will never commit a violent crime, so society should be tolerant of the people who engage in those activities unless they actually hurt or endanger other people. But the fact that these laws are being used not only to jail people for relatively harmless things, but also to lock people up based on their race, rather than how they actually behave, shows that the U.S. criminal justice system is judging people unfairly. But there are a few crimes where there's very little racial disparity in arrest rates. 12% of people arrested for drunk driving are black. 14% of arrestees for liquor law violations are black, and 16% of people arrested for drunkenness and public intoxication are black. One possible explanation for why there's almost no racial disparity in the enforcement of these laws is that blood alcohol content can easily be tested for, which gives police an objective way to determine whether or not someone's breaking the law without having to rely on their own judgment or on the judgment of witnesses who might be biased. But these are the only crimes for which blacks were less than twice as likely to be arrested as whites, and drunk driving was the only crime where whites were actually more likely to be arrested than blacks. The fact that significant racial bias exists in the enforcement of every single category of crime, except for those specific few crimes where there is an objective test that the police must administer in order to prove guilt or innocence, is honestly pretty damning evidence of bias, don't you think? But what does all that have to do with the recent cases of police shooting unarmed black men? Well, for that, let's go to slightly less racially inaccurate Jesus.
Hey, slightly less racially inaccurate Jesus here. Now let's think a moment about the deaths of Mike Brown and Eric Garner. These were two men who were both unarmed, and police used deadly force against for believing they behaved aggressively. Consider for a moment that the U.S. prison population would be half of what it is today if blacks and Hispanics were arrested at the same rates as whites. Now consider that 1 in 3 black men has spent or can expect to spend time in prison, with their first offenses being for mostly victimless, nonviolent crimes that do no direct harm to others. Now imagine for a moment that an armed gang that had a 1 in 3 chance of abducting you and locking you up was roaming your streets, specifically watching for people like you, and waiting for you to make any mistake, real or imagined, to harass you and destroy your life. When cornered by the members of this gang, how do you think that you would react? Consider that before judging black men for being too aggressive when dealing with the police. That doesn't mean all police are bad, but the police need policing as much as anyone else in society, and there are 3 ways we ought to do that. Number 1, we need to have more citizen oversight. This means independently elected police auditors and cameras on officers and their vehicles at all times, so the public can keep an eye on what the police are doing and remove bad officers when necessary, just like the police are sometimes needed to remove dangerous people from society. Number 2, the police need to police each other. County sheriffs, who are usually independently elected, need to be pressured to provide more oversight to local, state, and federal police in their counties who are not elected. Number 3, we need to police the kinds of laws we pass. Passing laws against victimless activities like drug use and gun ownership gives the police more options for ways they can penalize people they dislike, but it doesn't do much to actually protect people in society. Still, people will say this is too divisive and judgmental a subject for a tolerant guy like Jesus. But to them I say, From now on, in one house there will be 5 divided, 3 against 2, and 2 against 3.
Remember back in the good old days when you could talk about dividing people up 3 against 2 while talking about race without being tempted to make a 3/5 of a person joke? Racially Inaccurate Jesus remembers. A time when enslavement was something that people of all races could aspire to, and not just Africans and Native Americans colonized by Europeans and exported from their homelands. Why, once upon a time, even young Jewish boys and girls could grow up to be slaves. Then some people got this crazy idea that slavery was something that was only meant for certain races of people. And the good name of slavery, a time-honored tradition dating back to biblical times, was tarnished forever. Well, I hope you all have a good Martin Luther King Jr. Day and celebrate it by sharing this video and other information like it about how racism still affects society today and what we can do to fix those problems. And if you'd like to hear more of Jesus' advice, make sure to subscribe. Have a blessed day.